in our congregation. It's a time when many church groups start up or they regather after slowing down for the summer. Last week was Connection Sunday, with lots of groups out recruiting new members in the courtyard. And if you missed it, don't worry, there is another one next week. We always hold Connection Sundays on the weeks before and after Labor Day weekend. This month also marks the beginning of a year-long experiment we're doing with something called theological themes. Each month we'll take up a new theological concept, and we'll look at it from different angles, explore it further, connect it to events in our lives or in the world in these Sunday services. It's a way for us to get to more depth than we do when we spend only one service on a particular spiritual topic. And it's a chance to connect these themes to our religious heritage, to this time-tested tradition of ours, this big heart, big tent faith. Right? Exploring theological themes on Sundays also gives us a chance to explore those themes at other times through small group conversations, just taking that work even further. The themes we explore are part of a subscription in which we receive a bunch of supporting materials, and lots of our small group leaders have already signed up through the church office. If you're a leader, you can do that too. And they will receive a packet of theme-related chalice lightings and readings and discussion topics to choose from as we encourage and support each other in spiritual growth, one of our main missions. There's a new theme every month, so we're going to explore 12 this year. And there's also a theme overall for the year. This year's overarching theme is the phrase, "Let your life speak." Let your life speak. It's an old Quaker saying, also a title of a book by the teacher and activist Parker Palmer, about developing a sense of vocation. Vocation is the theological theme for September, and our reading this morning was an excerpt from that book. I'm going to reread the first part of that excerpt now so that we can start to tease apart Palmer's message and maybe also poke it with a stick, or at least stir it up a little bit, because anything worth taking seriously is worth challenging as it challenges us, right? Speaking of vocation, Palmer writes, "Our deepest calling is to grow into our own authentic selfhood, whether or not it conforms to some image of who we ought to be. As we do so, we will not only find the joy that every human being seeks, we'll also find our path of authentic service in the world. True vocation joins self and service. As Frederick Buechner asserts when he defines vocation as the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need." Palmer continues. He says, Buechner's definition starts with the self and it moves toward the needs of the world. It begins wisely where vocation begins, not in what the world needs, which is everything, but in the nature of the human self, in what brings the self joy, the deep joy of knowing that we are here on earth to be the gifts that God created. Palmer's a Quaker, and he weaves his understanding of the ultimate, the source of being that he calls God, into his writing. The myriad ideas that the word God may refer to are interesting to explore, but that's not what today is about, so I'm going to set that over here for now, gently set it aside, and we'll pick it up another time. Vocation is more about alignment than about religious beliefs. It's a spiritual issue because it has to do with the invisible part of our lives, what we call the depth aspect of being. But it has nothing to do with creeds. It's about what we each learn directly from our life, rather than from any particular guidebook about life. In Palmer's case, life seemed to involve a lot of wrong turns. As a young adult, he assumes he'll become a naval aviator and then take up a career in advertising, prestigious careers that follow in the footsteps of family friends. But after college, that doesn't feel right to him, so he goes to Union Theological Seminary, intending to become a minister instead. It comes as a great surprise to him, he says, when God speaks to him there in the form of mediocre grades and massive misery. Palmer gets the message. He won't be a minister. Next, he goes on to spend several years earning a PhD in sociology, but he doesn't like that very much either. He feels drawn to teaching, and he does enjoy teaching for a couple of years during his doctoral program, but it's the 1960s, and everybody, including Palmer, is blasting the hypocrisy and the power dynamics of big institutions. So he leaves academia, and he goes to work as a community organizer in Washington, D.C. 2 years later, Georgetown offers him a tenure-track position on its faculty, and he takes it. Seems perfect. He gets to teach, and Georgetown is paying him to continue being involved in that community organizing, too. But community organizing is kind of rough and tumble, and Palmer's skin is thin. So next, he takes a year-long sabbatical at a Quaker retreat center, and after that year, his right path unfolds. He becomes the center's director. Palmer explains he's not telling this story, his story, so that others will follow in his footsteps. Rather, what he wants to impart is the kind of learning he did along the way. He learned about accepting his shadow side, about failure and vulnerability, and about authenticity. He had a harrowing experience with depression, which in his case also ended up being a teacher for him. And yet, many of the specifics of Parker Palmer's story reflect a level of privilege that can make it a little bit challenging to digest. Only about a third of Americans have a bachelor's degree. While it's common for those who do go to college to switch majors at some point, it's not so common for that exploring to lead through a master's degree, and it's even less common to go on to get a PhD. Only about 2% of Americans complete some kind of doctoral degree. Most people just can't afford that much academic wandering, if they could even gain acceptance into those kinds of programs. And then, once gainfully employed, if indeed full-time employment is the goal or even feasible, a year-long sabbatical, right? When we find ourselves in a state of misalignment, unhappy with the work or the person we're projecting into the world, most of us are not able to drop everything and step out of our lives, and the lives that have formed around us, the ones we've created, too. We're not able to step out of all of that for a year-long retreat, as much as we might like to. Occasionally, I've heard somebody say that can't is a mindset, that we have the capacity to be more radical than we think, and that's partly true, but not everybody pays the same price or finds doors easily opened. At one point, Palmer tells the story of Rosa Parks. After reflecting on the courage she demonstrated by refusing to sit in the back of the bus, he concludes, quote, "The punishment imposed on us for claiming true self can never be worse than the punishment we impose on ourselves by failing to make that claim." I wish he had left the word never out. I don't think any of us is qualified to make that assessment about other people's lives. And I especially don't think that someone like Palmer, who's a white, economically secure, educated, cisgender man, cisgender meaning he's not transgender, a man who's in a heterosexual marriage, I don't think someone with that set of identity markers should make that judgment about people who face risks and barriers he has not experienced. I wasn't happy with my doctorate, so after a little work, I decided to go on retreat for a year. Sounds pretty privileged, pretty upper class, pretty out of touch with working 2 jobs to put food on the table and still not having health insurance, or being unable to work, or being able to work and needing a job but being turned down, or worse, ignored everywhere you apply, or being incarcerated. So to be honest, even though lots of people I respect are admirers of his work, the first time I read Palmer over a decade ago was also the last time. Until now. When his work popped up again, this time as a recommended resource for the theme of vocation, I decided to take another look. Because every life, in its own way, is a sacred text. And because although Palmer's path may have been rather cushy, The spiritual sense of vocation is something deeper. At one point, Palmer describes working on a serious sociological study when he was a graduate student, the kind of work where students put in hours behind the scenes working with the data that'll build out the study's results. Palmer and his lab partner were dismissive of the whole thing. They were careless in their work. They made rude remarks about the department and about the study itself. It did not take long for him to be fired, which came as a humiliating shock. Later, he was able to realize that he had only behaved that way, belittling everything, because deep down he was afraid he was not adequate enough to be a sociologist. And he was right. That was not the career for him. He wasn't good at it. Okay, again, it takes a certain level of arrogance and privilege to behave like that and then feel surprised when you're fired, right? But I can relate to the notion of acting like a jerk toward others to avoid confronting a hard truth about oneself. Can't you? Feelings are such shapeshifters. Fear can shift into judgment or self-loathing. Grief can shift into anger. Shame can turn into pushing others away. To become spiritually wise, we have to learn to look deeply into feelings and into ourselves to understand what's going on so we understand what's needed. That process of self-reflection, growth, and self-acceptance is what forms the heart of Palmer's words. Soul work. Our deepest calling is to grow into our own authentic selfhood, he says. True vocation joins self and service. I'm going to come back to that service part. For now, if vocation is what happens when authentic self meets service, then vocation begins with asking, who am I? What's my nature? We don't come into this world without personalities, you know. Certain things attract us, other things repel. I came into this world already sizing things up. My great-grandmother noticed it right away. She held me as a newborn, and in her Appalachian, Kentucky speech, she said, "When this one starts talking, she's going to have a lot to say." Well, look at that. I was skeptical, and I loved language and stories and people. I would converse with people of any age. I had a strong will, which felt to me like clarity of purpose, right? And I took charge. What traits arrived with you into this world? Who are you? What's your nature? Whatever it is, it's neither good nor bad, though other people may praise or condemn your traits. They just are. They are who you are. How they show up between you and the world depends on the context and on your self-awareness. Those traits will also be at the heart of your vocation, of the way yourself joins with service. They'll express themselves in whatever you do. Where we get into trouble is when we try to force ourselves into a mold that doesn't fit. In Palmer's case, that looked like trying to become a sociologist, a minister, or an ad man, when what he needed to do was teach. When we try to mold ourselves into an image that others project on us, Palmer calls that living life from the outside in instead of from the inside out. Living life from the outside in instead of from the inside out. It does not have to involve the work we may do. We might also suppress our authentic selves and put forward a different image. For example, if we are gay and want others to believe we are straight, or if we are atheists but make a confession of faith in order to not fit in or not lose our parents' love. We may do those kinds of things out of a very real need for safety, love, and community, but it's heavy and it's lonely when our real selves long to be free. In other cases, we could succumb to pressure from our own egos, which want us to have admiration and approval and power. Or we might experience entrenched social pressures like racism, sexism, and transphobia, which exert tremendous force to shape us and our lives in ways that may not reflect our authentic self. One thing Palmer discovered is that whatever is at the heart of your vocation, whatever your true nature and your gifts are, those will manifest in whatever you do eventually. In my teens and 20s, I cleaned houses to make ends meet. One of the people I did housekeeping for was Lola, a 94-year-old woman with a gentle spirit. Hummingbirds loved her. She paid me to plant her garden, which I did not know how to do, so she walked me through each step. She was patient. She was patient when I didn't know which plants were weeds. She was patient when she asked me to cook for her and she found my cooking too weird to eat. When I took my son, who was 3 years old at the time, to visit her, he gently took Lola's loose, wrinkly upper arm in his chubby little hand and asked, "Why do you have so much skin?" She told him in her knowing, kindly way, "It's because I'm going to go back into the earth soon." That was fine with him. He had spent lots of time in our garden, which we had because Lola had taught me how. Although he'd cried the first time he saw me pull spent tomato plants out of the ground one October, he was consoled when I told him they would become part of the earth for our new garden in spring. Lola's answer connected. Not long after, I took my son to see my grandmother, his great-grandmother, whom he greeted with, "When are you going back into the earth?" That look she shot me, you guys. Lola had made peace with herself, with her gifts and with her shortcomings. She had an authenticity that you could feel in her presence. I think of her when I read the poem by May Sarton called "Now I Become Myself." It begins, "Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces. Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces." The deepest vocational question is, who am I? What is my nature? That's what will express itself in whatever you do. I can't remember what kind of professional or paid work Lola had done in her life. I think at one point she'd worked at a school for troubled girls. But she brought herself to the experience of having a housekeeper, one her family had hired to keep an eye on her as much as to keep the house clean. And she turned it into an act of service on her part, teaching me and my son about gardening and about old age. Vocation joins self and service. One more thing about Lola. She was going blind. She could see shapes well enough to get the gist of whatever she was looking at, like me pulling out the wrong plant. But she could no longer make out the details. After Lola told me this, the next time I came to clean her house, I wore bright red lipstick so she could see me smile. My smile made her smile. I started wearing that red lipstick everywhere. I still do. Lola joined herself and service in her interactions with me, and I'm certain that actually being curious and receptive about her gifts, and yes, deciding to wear the red lipstick, were examples of something in my nature, the heart of my vocation, which was showing up in my work as a housekeeper. Service might mean finding ways to let your authentic self shine through work that feels constraining or does not necessarily inspire you, or perhaps in the service industry. That reminds me of a quote often attributed to Abraham Lincoln: "Whatever you are, be a good one. Whatever you are, be a good you." Service is also something we do as a volunteer in church or elsewhere. or we may be in relationship with others in a way that is an act of service, like Lola was. Combining authentic self with service might be our main gig, or it may be a precious thing on the side, a place or a relationship or a kind of task through which we can express our truest selves, a precious thing that might be like an oasis if the cost of being true to ourselves and the rest of life still feels too high. There are so many ways we can join self with service, many ways to express vocation. There's also more than one way to interpret the phrase, let your life speak. And as we close, I want to circle back to that for a moment. One interpretation is, let your life speak on your behalf, as in what you do with your life says more than what you say with your mouth. And there's truth to that. It also can be a little bit intimidating. It sounds like pressure to live a very exemplary life. There are days when, if my life could actually speak, I'm afraid it might mumble something about cheesy carbohydrates, right? Or a nap. Another way to understand the phrase, though, is let your life speak to you, as in be attentive to it. After all, it is a sacred text. One of our religious sources in Unitarian Universalism, besides written texts of the world's religions, is direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Our lives are filled with transcendence, mystery, and wonder, not always in that order, but always sacred. When we put those two understandings together, let your life speak for you and let your life speak to you, then I think we've got it. If we let our lives speak to us, we will be at peace in letting them speak for us.
We invite you to rise in body or spirit to join us in our closing song.